the TCPA, which is Town and Country Planning Association, and we have the vision for homes, places and communities in which everyone can thrive. We've got quite a long-standing relationship with Sport England and have been working on a sort of healthy, more active communities project for the last 4 years. And it's been a real sort of meeting of minds, really. So as Sport England has pivoted towards this sort of wellbeing focus and wellbeing strategy, the TCPA have really understood in a way how our work on healthy placemaking and reuniting health and place has fitted together with that. So it's been a really great partnership for the last 4 years. And we really work with people. You know, we don't sort of sit on the sidelines and say, well, you should do this, that and the other. We're really keen to work with people and have those conversations and explore issues and challenge and inspire to create healthy, sustainable and resilient places with a real focus that they are fair for everyone and reducing inequalities, which I know fits very well with everything that you're working on in terms of active partnerships. And our real strength is that we've been around for a long time and we have a really good reputation across the sector. And that means that we can provide, you know, independent, evidence-based advice, advocacy and influencing, and can help sort of unlock some situations sometimes where, you know, people aren't necessarily speaking the same language, or people sort of want to convene, but it can be quite difficult because of history and local politics, and having somebody like the TCPA come in is a really beneficial thing. We are a charity, so we do a lot of our work based on project funding, but also we are a membership organisation, and so we always encourage people that if you're interested in the sorts of things that we're talking about and doing, then please sort of think about joining us and being a member. There are some perks to membership, including access to our journal and events and things like that. So yeah, do consider it if you're able. So we were founded all the way back in 1899 by a guy called Sir Ebenezer Howard, and we won't really dwell on the history lesson, but he was working in a time and thinking in a time when there were some real issues around how we were living and the environments in which we lived. And there was a lot of injustice, there was a lot of environmental pollution and poor health because of the way that people were living close to factories, so the way that land use was being sort of mixed together. And there were lots of issues with deprivation and sort of the fractious nature of sort of social relationships, and people didn't have access to clean air, they didn't have access to light, didn't have access to nature if they had moved into the sort of industrialized areas, and it just wasn't really working. And so a group of people came together and really thought about, well, actually, how could we do this different? You know, what are the good things about living in towns and the good things about living in the countryside, and how do we sort of bring those together around some key principles that would create places that people can thrive in? And that's thriving economically, thriving socially, thriving from a health point of view, and over the life course as well. And so all of the principles that sort of form the Garden City movement, which is what they came up with, really continue to provide us as an organisation with a rich and creative springboard for shaping the future. And Hugh knows a lot more about this than I do, but if it's something you want to touch on in the questions, then please do. But we're sort of working on a whole project to look at how those principles still apply today and how we interpret them, you know, in 2023 and what they mean, and how we can still create places based on those principles that will see sort of thriving places and people, and also really, really aware that we need to do this in order for our environment to thrive as well in the face of climate change. So that's a little bit about our history. The sort of key things that we're working on are sort of covered in these sort of high level titles. So we do a lot of work around climate change, mitigation and resilience. So how the planning system can sort of work to support and refocus on sustainability, which I know is a big theme for Sport England as well. Community participation and social justice. We have a Garden Cities and New Communities group, So if anyone's sort of building large new communities or large urban extensions, there's a group of local authorities that meet who are all doing the same thing, creating tens of thousands of houses in new communities. And actually, how do we make those the best that they can be? How do we use the Garden City principles to make great places in those local authority areas? We have a green parks and green infrastructure network, which again brings together people who are interested in looking after parks, so leisure teams, green parks teams, and then also quite increasingly health and wellbeing groups who are interested in the health and wellbeing outcomes that you can get from good green infrastructure, including sort of the impacts on mental health. So that's what we've got as well. And also a stream around healthy placemaking, which is where I work. So that's supporting local authorities to think about health and wellbeing policies in the local plan process, which we'll come to explaining in a bit. But also then around the concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods, which I'll touch on in a second, and healthy homes principles as well. If any of that sounds interesting, I think the thing that I'd really encourage you to do is just go and have an explore on our website. There's an awful lot of information on there. There's resources pages, there's webinar recordings. So you could, you know, if you've got a cup of coffee break at some point, just go and have a good flick through. And if you've got any questions, then you can also get in touch with us about the things that we're working on and the types of support that we could offer. So I'm just going to touch on a few things quite quickly that we're sort of interested in at the moment, and which you might find interesting as well. One is our Healthy Homes campaign. So we're looking at the gap really in the policy landscape. So everyone sort of thinks that there must be some basic standards that new homes must be built to ensure that they're healthy. And most people assume that those are sort of tucked away somewhere in building regulations. But actually, there isn't a strong framework for thinking about what homes must be like in order to be healthy. And so we've been pushing through the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill to try and get a set of principles embedded in law that will actually mean that all new homes created have to have some of these things. And they're really basic things. So it's about having minimum space requirements, that they should have, you know, natural light in there, be safe and secure from crime, risk of fire, etc. So really basic stuff. And we're sort of working on getting that hopefully into legislation. As you can imagine, it's not an easy push to do that, but we've been working on it and having some success, sponsored by Lord Nigel Crisp in the House of Lords. Part of why that might be interesting is actually because we know that a healthy home sits within a healthy neighbourhood. You can't sort of create this wonderful healthy home and then plonk it in a really unhealthy neighbourhood and expect it to stay healthy. That seems a bit simplistic, but I hope you can sort of see what I'm driving at. And actually it is about these scales. We need to work across scales. So you could look at it even in terms of from the scale of a room to a house, to a neighbourhood, to a town or a city, to a region. You know, how do we think about health across all of those scales and make sure that where we can and where it's appropriate, we're sort of trying to push so that everything is all headed in the same direction towards a health sort of focus and outcome for people. So if you're interested in that, that's all on our website. And there is also a photo book of pictures taken of homes that are not healthy and that have been created through what we call permitted development rights, and Hugh's going to go into that in a bit, but there's lots and lots on our website about it, so please go and have a look at that. So thinking about this then next step up the scale, we also do a lot of work around 20-minute neighbourhoods, and this is really a framework for thinking about what makes a healthy and successful place in a really holistic way. So since 2021, we've been working to try and help sort of have this discussion in the English planning system, but very much aware that it takes much more than planning to be able to do this, because they have certain levers that they can pull, but it's not going to be possible for them to do all of it. And quite rightly, it shouldn't fall to one, no holistic solution is going to fall to one department or one profession. So we've been working on this, lots and lots of resources on our website. We find that it's a really intuitive and appealing idea for lots of people, and it can be a really good sort of coalescing idea that people like to sort of think about, well, how can we organise around this? As it can be an organising principle for policy and for local authorities to think about how they want to think about place-based approaches to their work. So again, lots of things on our website, including our webinar series that we've been running since 2020, and they're all on the website, so you can go back and take a look at those. And Sport England have fed into quite a few of those, actually, and it's been really good to explore sort of different aspects of what this idea is. We're not suggesting that we've got all the answers, but we are trying to find sort of case studies and good practice, and sort of explore some of the key things that are going to have to be thought about to make this work. So a quick plug is that the next one of our 20-minute neighbourhood webinars is actually going to be on the 29th of June. And whenever we talk about 20-minute neighbourhoods, somebody always says, but what about rural places? So it's about time that we started to unpack that a bit. So we're going to look at sort of what does a rural expression of 20-minute neighbourhoods look like? And it's going to not focus on the challenges, but actually focus on the opportunities for innovation that rural areas provide. So there'll be a variety of speakers, and you can it's free, you can register to attend on our website through the events pages, but it will sort of have a look at things like quiet lanes, so the work that Sustrans have been doing around quiet lanes, looking at the Blenheim estate in Oxfordshire and how they've been working to allow connections across their estate so that the villages that surround can actually make their way to and from different assets in the area across the Blenheim estate itself, including allowing school children from villages to get to their schools in a safe way that avoids the roads. There'll be a bit of a focus on co-location of services and community businesses with the Plunkett Foundation, and also a community group in Somerset who've been working on micro provision of care at the local level, so linking up sort of local care providers with people who need it in their community, and sort of keeping employment local, making really good social connection, and then also reducing the need to travel so there's less congestion, and sort of the impact that has then on carbon emissions and things like that. So that was a little bit of a rattle through of the TCPA. Always happy to answer questions about that, and if you want to get in touch, then please do. I'm now going to hand it over to Hugh Ellis, who is the Director of Policy at the TCPA. He joined us, I wasn't here, he joined way before me, not that he's old. He joined in 2009 and has spent a long time looking at the planning system, thinking about the planning system, poking the planning system, and trying to think about how it can be improved, working with all sorts of people in all sorts of places. He has a wealth of knowledge, and I think the most fun thing about Hugh, which I hope will come across today, is that he knows an awful lot, but he has a real optimism about what the planning system can achieve and what's possible. And so I'm going to hand over to Hugh, and he's going to lead us through local planning in England.
Thanks, Gemma. That introduction sets me up to be like slightly strange, really boring, and very old. So thank you.
You're welcome.
It's a pleasure. It's really nice to see everyone, and I'm just going to try and bookend what I'm going to say by running through the English planning system. If you, as I often do, develop a migraine during PowerPoint presentations, during what I have to say, that is the right feeling to have in trying to understand English planning. It's really been made very, very complicated. But the really important thing about it is that it is also fundamental to getting the change that I think you're all trying to seek in terms of active travel and other agendas. And the reason for that, in a nutshell, is because the planning system makes between 450 and 650,000 decisions on development every year. It is the gateway test for what gets built, on the one hand. And on the other hand, it's the way that we can produce democratic long-term strategies for how we design places. So whether we regard it as being difficult and boring, or whether we regard it as being inspirational and important, it's non-negotiable part of the landscape of affecting change. And that's really the most important thing. So in order to be able to influence that, and I know we've got a range of different people with different backgrounds, in order to be able to maximize that effect, it's just good to know what the nuts and bolts of the system operate on. But for me, planning is split into two. It's partly about pragmatics and design and those issues, but it's also meant to be about visionary utopia. And I'm always very happy to talk about utopianism, because that's what the TCPA is about. We built it at Letchworth and well in other places, and that's the driving force of what makes people get into planning and into the built environment, is the idea that we can make better places for people. Gemma, are you okay to move us on? I'll try and run through these slides reasonably quickly. And the slide pack I know is going to be available, I think, Gemma. So when we get to some of the slides later on, which have basically got technical content on planning reform, I'm going to be really quick. Also, can people please interrupt me if they think I've got things wrong or gone on too long, or I don't know, blood's coming from people's ears and they really want to talk about something else. Very happy to do that. So we've talked about the importance of it in terms of why planning matters. So next slide, please. We'll crack on. And hopefully this will give us a sort of a sense of, why the built environment's important, and to both happiness, to health, well-being, and increasingly to thriving and flourishing. And a lot of the work of the TCPA that I won't repeat, that Gemma's just talked about, it illustrates that relationship really, really powerfully, I think. I'm, for example, at the moment thinking a lot about how loneliness as a problem in society is actually being designed into the way we build housing. So there's a relationship between car dependency, between loneliness, and perhaps the relationship between artificial intelligence and how that may make things much worse in terms of interactions, potentially, that people might have. Next slide, please. So you can see all those relationships happily playing out in the media, and how they relate to these wider public health challenges that we face. And I think the point of this slide really is just each one of these challenges has a relationship to the built environment. Each one of them we can find solutions to. And again, just to bookend some of the things I might say, just from the conversation we had in the breakout room, I think the truth is we're not short of technical solutions, are we? We know how to do this stuff. The question is, why don't we? Is really the question that I think comes to mind. Why are we not delivering this stuff? And a lot of that relates to political awareness and senior corporate awareness about whether this stuff is important. But the bottom line is, as we found with the Healthy Homes campaign, we can save enormous amounts of money for the NHS if we get healthy environments right. And that's a critical objective. So next slide, please. So my favorite little picture, this is when I bang my head on the desk. This is a house near me. I'm in North Derbyshire. If anyone's on the call from that, this is just a bit of Northeast Derbyshire. It's two houses, and I use this as a training tool for what not to do. There's no garden. That's a communal parking area at the back. There's no back door. It's only a front door. Those are escape windows for two properties at the bottom. So if there's a fire in the front door, you have to climb out the window. It's needlessly small, horrifically designed, got no PV, and is set in the context where there is no walkable shop and no walkable school. It's utter crap. Okay, that's a technical phrase. And the amount of crap that we're building, which bakes in problems for future generations, makes me want to weep. It's by no means, however, the worst of what we're doing, but it is, I think, far too often what we're being presented with by the volume house builders. And to be clear, it is in local government, we can strategize and consent, but we no longer, at least not to any scale, develop and build ourselves. But that is the direction of travel. That's where we're going to have to go back to. Next slide, please. I think these next ones are ones that make Gemma bang her head on the desk. Love the footpath, Gemma, on this one, isn't it? I mean, let's squeeze it down as far as we possibly can. It's just bloody ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous to see development like that. Next slide, please. I promise I'll stop. Now, we were debating this, whether or not with advances in artificial intelligence, this was fake, but I've been assured, Gemma, that it isn't fake, but you just can't make it up, can you? You really can't. And I think, just bear in mind, there's so much bullshit talked about the sort of quality new development being produced, and the reality of it is often this. Okay, next slide, please. So let's just focus and crack through the sort of basics of town and country planning. It is highly complex as a process now, because the law's not been consolidated for 30 years. And because if you're a planner, and I know there are some on the call, you will know that the biggest source of delay in the planning system is national government. If they stop changing the rules every 5 minutes, we might actually be able to get on and do something. And because I'm at the end of my career, and because I'm trying to save time, I will be very honest about why I think the government's planning reform is total nonsense. I can't see a single aspect of it that helps people deliver what we're trying to deliver in terms of positive outcomes. But this gives you a sense of the structure of planning and the importance of national planning policy framework sitting at the very top, of which there is currently a review that we might come back to. That really sets a very powerful overarching framework for the way that local plans and individual decisions, which we'll come to, are made. And the national planning policy framework is a confused mess, but there are hooks in it which are positive and can be used to actually drive change. But it's critically important that you understand the NPPF and what it says, because that's often the document that's used to kind of often as a full stop in conversations about what's possible. The NPPF is policy, not law. You do not have to abide by it if you've got good reasons not to, and there's no reason why you can't innovate above it. Nothing at all to stop you doing that. There are issues about viability that we may pick up in the debate. So then you've got national planning practice guidance, and you've got the National Design Code. That's probably the most important document I would flag to you all on this, because the National Design Code, although far from perfect, has shifted the debate about good design and the elements of good design in a positive direction. Underneath national, you've got, if you're in London, you've got the London Plan. If you're outside London, you've got total chaos, because we don't have coordinated strategic planning in England. Outside the London Plan, you've got combined authorities with different levels of status to their strategic documents. And underneath that, the thing I would just say, if you take nothing else away, the local plan. The local plan is the statutory development plan. And for non-planners, what that means is the most powerful strategy a local government can write, because it has a legal basis and a legal weight in decision making. So it's a statutory development plan is the place to be. And if you've not got your agenda framed inside the local plan in a local authority area, you're always going to be running from behind. It's critically important to get that built in. Neighbourhood plans, kind of from 2011, are produced by parish councils, town councils, and neighbourhood forums in urban areas that aren't parished or towned. And they have the same status as a local plan in law. So they're important. Very, very rarely, I think, Gemma, are we seeing them used particularly for sort of active travel or for health yet. But there's no reason why they couldn't be. So that's interesting. And then finally, you've got the process at the very bottom where planning permission is granted. And there's a big gap in planning between policy and development plans and development management, which is sort of Cinderella activity very often. But that's really where, the cutting edge is really happened. That's when consent is approved. And inside that, you've got things like Section 106, which I'll come to, which secure potential benefits and money out of the development process. So that is the sort of top to bottom of national policy. So that's the first year of your degree in planning done. Next slide, please. And then this is roughly how plans get made. If you've been involved in local plan making, you'll go, yeah, right, it really happens like this. But in theory, this is how they get made. Often they take a long time. Why do they take a long time? Because politicians change their mind halfway through due to elections. It's the biggest cause of delay. But you can see that there's an evidence gathering, issues and options, consultation, draft plan, further consultation, testing by the planning inspectorate. And if you're a non-planner, the reason that planners often look worn out is because they've got to get their policy past a test overseen by the planning inspector, which is the soundness test. And that's where issues about financial viability and the objections of developers have proved to be very powerful. And in fact, the recent decision at Saltcross in Oxfordshire, where the planning inspector ripped out some really good zero carbon targets from a new development, shows how powerful PINs can be, and also how misguided many of their decisions are, partly because they as a group don't necessarily understand the cutting edge of things like active travel and action on climate change. No disrespect to them, but nobody's perfect. So you can see that process is demanding and it's expensive and it's important, but it provides an opportunity to talk to people, talk to communities, to gather evidence and really embed these agendas in the local plan process. And then once you've finished it, you basically just start again. And I'll come to why this is all changing quite rapidly in the levelling up agenda. So that's the plan-led system. Next slide, please. These are sort of key, these are key elements. Gemma, I'm going to ask your help here because I'm so stupid, I can't do this and look at questions in the chat box as well. So if you shout to me if there's something immediate I need to respond to, I'll just keep going. And I'll try and pick them up when I get to the end. These are the key elements of the local plan, which you will be familiar with. Written statement, which is basically the policy bulk of the plan, site allocations, where stuff goes, the colouring in bit, which we all love. The design codes, which will be a new legal requirement. Everyone has to have the representation of a design code somewhere in the plan. Neighbourhood plans and then supplementary planning guidance. The first four elements of that have the legal status of development plan, and the fifth element doesn't actually. That's a more informal document, but supplementary planning guidance is very often what we use to do specific site briefs, development briefs, design guidance at the moment. So just moving on to the next slide. This is development management, and you can see the same kind of process runs through pre-application consultation, which developers can use, submission, consultation with statutory consultees, and we'll come back to who is a statutory consultee, Gemma, won't we, in a second. Then officers report, the critical role that officers play in looking at the local plan, adding up the development, seeing whether it complies, seeing whether it's delivering the sorts of design measures we've said, and then planning committee and decision. And of course, these are political decisions on a large scale. So that's ultimately why local authority elected members are so important in this. And then finally, the decision. And you can see the timescales there. Just on the question on design guidance, I think that my elaboration around that would be that we've got a national design guidance, which is essentially describing the elements of good design, which then local authorities can pick and choose, if they want to adopt as part of their local plan process. The precise way that the design guide is expressed in the local plan is not fixed in law or policy. You can kind of do it as you want, but the elements of good design are there at national level for you to draw down. Some local authorities will prepare a design guide for a specific development or in relation to particular area of policy. So there is quite a lot of wriggle room about the way local authorities do it, but you do need to represent some form of design guidance in your local plan process going forward. Okay, next slide, please. And this is the bit that makes me cry. It actually literally did make me cry when I started talking about it at a conference. This is permitted development deregulation. This is Luton, actually. And the government is so morally bankrupt in the way that it thinks about good design that it decided in 2013 that deregulating the way we convert commercial and office buildings to residential use was a good wheeze to push up the numbers. But it's resulted in slum housing for some of the most vulnerable people in society. At the time in 2013, when this was done, there wasn't even a requirement to have a window when these were converted. And there is no requirement now to have a window. The reason we fought for the requirement in PDR that a residential unit should have access to natural light, but that's still not a view from a window. That can be through a light tunnel or reflected like natural light. I knew this nation was bloody finished when we started doing this, and we've created about 90,000 units through PDR, of which about 60% are chronically, horrifically poor. Some of these are on industrial estates. It's not just the quality of the places themselves, it's the location of them. However, to be more positive, if you need to learn why planning in the built environment and design is important, follow the line through PDR to understand what we've got wrong and then try and fix it. But a lot of these places universally lack one thing, which is any play space. So we're creating places essentially where kids live in car parks. And what I have seen with my own eyes PDR flats converted on industrial estates with kids playing in the bloody car park while their industrial estates being used as an industrial estate. And that's been the driving force really for me not retiring, as I probably should soon, and going on throwing bricks at the government about why this stuff is so important. I just wanted to, it's just that sense that your jobs are so important on this agenda in local government. It's so critical that we get this stuff, and this is damaging people's lives. It's not academic. This is when you know that planning is really important. Next slide, please, before I start singing opera, Gemma, and becoming too emotional about it.
Hugh, can I just jump in there? Is that,
of course you can. Yeah.
Is that photo the finished residential design, or is that what it looked like before they converted it?
That's the before, but this was 14 flats, half of them in the roof space. And when this was consented, there was no requirement to create any window space in it. And because PDR, intrinsically is a form of consent, but of course doesn't allow the local authority to think about health and well-being, because its prior approval for permitted development gives you these very tight criteria about what you can think about. And then over time, what's happened is that PDR considerations have expanded, partly because we've been, campaigning to make that happen. So now now there's that issue around light. And now, interestingly, they've imposed a space standard. The national space standard for PDR has come into force. And so so there's been an evolution. But as to the final outcome of that, I have to, I guess, one day go back and have a look. There's very little monitoring about these places. But yeah, there's no requirement to do any external design, partly because to do external design would have required planning permission. So there was
so the final structure stays virtually the same. It's not like they've knocked it down or
no.
They've taken the roof off or anything.
No.
Wow.
To get PDR permission, you stay. The moment you start doing that. I mean, they're now deregulating demolition, of course, but the moment you need to do that, you would require planning permission. So yeah, it is pretty. I'm sorry, this is as grim as it can be, I think, really. So I'll quickly move on. Next slide, please. So these quick concepts, then, just to be clear, were ones we can come back to. 5-year land supply, of course, for planners is now changing, but it's still a very dominant feature of how we plan. Planning has been, if you like, distorted into producing numbers. That is moving now because they're changing the housing forecasting regime, and we're just waiting to see, although it's not yet been published, an updated version of the NPPF to do that. But that's why I think it's been very difficult for planners, because essentially they've been kicked really hard to not worry about quality, but to worry about numbers, which of course is a disaster. Viability is really important now, to stress to people who are non-planners that part of the soundness test in policy is that developers can argue that requirements for good design are not viable in terms of commercial development process. That's also changed, and guidance is more progressive. London has led the way in supporting, sort of kicking back against that argument, but it's very difficult in low demand areas for reasons I'll come to in a second. And essentially where development values are low, developers can say, well, there's no money in this, so we're going to build crap because that's all the market will bear. And that has been a challenge. Section 106 clause in the original Primary Act, that's all Section 106 means, allowing for a contract to be agreed between developers and local authorities to capture some of the development value. In high demand areas, in richer areas, it yields enormous. It yields about £7 billion a year, so it's big money. Everybody wants a slice of Section 106 and community infrastructure levy, which is another way of basically tapping the same values. Everyone wants a bit of that money, and it's really important for all of your agenda, because most of you will be trying to get resources out of Section 106 or SIL, community infrastructure levy, to pay for active travel measures, or for other issues around climate change you might want to implement. So really important. But I mean, if you're in parts of the sunny southeast, then Section 106 and SIL yields a great deal. But if you're in Gateshead, it yields nothing, because there's no development value to tap. So it really reinforces inequality across the nation. And as I said, now we've got net gain, we've got affordable housing, got active travel, you've got education. Everybody wants a piece of the pie. That's a challenge. And then finally, a couple of other things. What is a material consideration? It's often used a lot. Actually, it's the issues that can mean that a decision isn't made in accordance with the local plan. In fact, the courts have been pretty clear that anything relates to the use and development of land is capable of being material. The issue is some things are more material than others. I won't go any further in this because I can feel the pain in the virtual room, but very happy to come back to it. And then statutory consultees, and just to flag from that, I guess that statutory consultees now include Active Travel England from the 1st of June. That said, the consultee threshold that they're involved in, just looking at it, is very high, isn't it? 150 plus residential units. I mean, the vast majority of development, therefore, they are not a statutory consultee for, because 150 plus development is, in my experience, things above that level are a tiny fraction of the amount of housing we actually consent. So it's unfortunate that that bar is quite high. Personally, I'd like to see it, brought right down, but it does give you some sense of their opportunity to engage with applications on that scale. Next slide, please. And then finally, before we sort of break for a second, what makes success? Above all, political leadership. I won't talk about the other things. Community engagement and political leadership are very linked. But if you don't have political support in a local authority to drive these more positive agendas through, then it's extremely difficult. And I think that's also about the awareness of communities. I feel quite positive that a lot of communities do and are trying to do the right thing, particularly on things like climate change, once they're given good access to information, to possibilities, to opportunity. They will respond really, really well to that. It's part of our job to help empower people to make those choices. But of course, it can go badly wrong, as we've seen in terms of traffic policy in London, where it falls into populist politics. Okay, next slide, please. And then just pause here for a second, because we've just done the degree course. The next bit is a bit easier. Is there anything that people want to raise at this point? Any questions people have? And just to say, Gemma, I don't understand the English planning system. Nobody does. So there is no question too simple, too straightforward. It is a very difficult system to get your head around.
I was just going to pick up a couple from the chat, but equally, if people do want to jump in, then let's do that too. So there was a question about Section 106 and SIL being watered down or removed or misallocated before completion of projects, and does that happen to any great extent, or is that a bit of an urban myth?
It does happen, partly because there can be arguments about viability around Section 106, and it depends on the quality of the agreement that's been made. There's also a wider issue about monitoring and enforcement, which, that picture of the path, Gemma, the truth about a lot that the public planning service is in deep crisis. Okay, it's had major cuts, and very often there isn't the capacity to go out and look what gets built. And that actually also is a challenge. So compliance on Section 106, compliance on actually what's been designed and has that been delivered, is a major problem. But on the whole, with Section 106 agreements, if they're well constructed with a clear objective in local plan policy, supported by a strong and effective 106 agreement, then you should be in the driving seat as a local authority in making sure that should be enforced. I would say more generally, the relationship has become that in development, that volume house builders and major developers will rock up to your offices with 8-9 people, including a QC, to bully the hell out of a local authority about what they're trying to do in their local plan. I think you have to be very robust and very self-confident and tell them to get out of here, come back when they've got a better scheme. Get that culture where, yeah, we know there's going to be a compromise down this road, but we're not making it. Right, that's how you start out negotiating with the private sector. Up yours is the first issue, and then go from there. Never surrender major policy requirements until they've basically drawn a weapon, and then maybe you have to compromise. But it's getting that culture back in of self-confidence. Local authorities are in charge. You understand the public interest. They don't. It's about making sure you get that policy firmly agreed. It's easy for me to say. I don't have to do it, of course, but there you go.
So you sort of laid out the framework or the bones of the planning system, but there's quite a few questions about, okay, but then how do we get communities to influence? Yeah. How does that work? And what are the key relationships that potentially need to be sort of have some time put into them, or who are the people that the active partnerships might need to be talking to at every level?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the issue about people's involvement in planning is really close to our hearts. And of course, on the one level, there's a statutory framework for involvement in the local plan. But for most people, planning is incredibly difficult to understand, and it relies on something that local government have found it hard to do, which is actually having officers that can go to and reach out and explain. We used to do this stuff really well, in terms of participation, and some local authorities even, were organising citizens' assemblies and finding innovative ways to engage communities. But as a bare minimum, my advice is that communities have most of them, well-developed networks. For example, where a local plan is, dealing with sort of issues around flood risk areas, it's amazing how powerful the Flood Forum as an organisation is across the country, providing a kind of set of network organisations and communities who can help, I guess, frame the debate in a community. But you've got to see it as a priority and invest in it, and that's a problem. Where does the money come to do that? But having that conversation is absolutely critical. If you're reaching out to have that conversation about the future of a community, you're also shaping the future politicians by having that debate, and that's really important.
Nick, do you want to jump in there? Put your hand up.
Yeah, so I was just going to come back on Hugh's point around the Section 106, the challenges that we have and still really, because we had a chat in our little group before about the issue that if you're trying to drive particularly behavior, even if you get a well-designed place and you're trying to drive behavior change, the issue is when the infrastructure goes in. So the problem with SIL is it goes into usually a pot, which then can be provided anywhere, of course, anywhere across the local authority area. So it doesn't even have to be associated with a development. So the big challenge is if you're really trying to behavioural change, when people are going to come in, even if you create, a great walking and cycling environment, if the school isn't there from day one, if the shop isn't there for day one, people are just going to opt to jump in their cars and drive. So it's a big problem at the moment because the infrastructure is still coming after the developments. And I think we'll talk about it, that some of the work with the master developers is easier because they have the control over the land and they will look to put some of that infrastructure in at the first phase. But it is still a massive challenge with the planning system when we talk about trying to drive behaviour change.
Nick, I just a quick response. I mean, I couldn't agree more. And one of the reasons why we're facing such challenges is the development model is very badly broken. And all I can say is, and I know people will be shouting at me when I say this, but the joy of refreshing yourself in a city like Freiburg is just a simple truth that you build the tram system first and then you build the housing and behaviour change follows. I mean, we know this, don't we? It's so self-evidently obvious. But the way we've got caught in this country is really, I think, to forget that master developer role. And that makes us very unique in Europe. And I think the interesting thing between Section 106 and core design principles is there as well, because what you're really talking about, Nick, there is what should be embedded in the master planning of a development and how it's phased and delivered. I think too often in English planning, we're trying to retrofit or ameliorate actually really poorly located development. And I think we can see the evidence of that. We're building far too many bolt-on estates, which don't have, absolutely condemn people to car-based lifestyles before we've even started. And that cannot stand. And I would be refusing them. And then the developers would say, well, we'll appeal and we'll win. And I'll say, well, up yours, try. That's just me. I'm allowed to say that. But we've got to bite back a little bit because there's a little bit, I think, I detect of surrender going on because essentially local authorities have been kicked around so hard. Anyway.
I was just going to say back on that, Hugh, and that again is the problem of, that was the role of local authorities as the master developer, and that's been kind of sucked out of them of where they used to be able to do that role, either putting in the housing or assembling the land to do that. And now it's sort of on the bigger schemes is given off to Homes England and doing that bit. But the failure there again is all that kind of what was done on the region, as you said before, the strategic and sub-regional planning that happened before to identify that key infrastructure that needed to go in. Beforehand has all been ripped out. So yeah, it is a continual challenge, as you say.
Yeah.
I feel that was a planner's conversation just there. Dave, do you want to come back in and drag us back?
Right, thanks, Gemma. I was just keeping an eye on the chat to see the sort of things on the questions. And it's really a follow-on, Hugh, from the question you answered about that came from Julie and others about how do we engage or how do we support people and organisations to engage communities in that decision. There was a sort of second question that says, particularly for active partnerships, who are the key allies that active partnerships can connect with to influence either planning decisions, the local plan, and just kind of build that narrative and that story about active environments and changing things for the better? Who do active partnerships, who should they be connecting up with at a local level to try and you know, put the influence on these things as you suggest?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I can't answer it necessarily very well. I mean, the first and simplest answer to the question, that as partnerships in particular areas, it's your relationship with, you know, with those local authority planners who are developing the local plan, that you need to be in that debate and in that room. And that does require effort and resource, which I know is difficult. But for example, I think the critical question about that is the assembly of the evidence for the local plan, being in at the very beginning of that process with the evidence and presenting that powerfully about how that will then influence the benefits of active travel and how that, for example, influences design outcomes. But then in terms of sustaining that, what tends to happen is that there are two other constituencies of people, aren't there? But it is by all, we were talking about this in the breakout groups, it's local elected members and persuading them. And then the final constituency is that wider local civil society. Those are the organisations that always rock up at local plan inquiries. And they tend to be represented very powerfully around the environment and landscape, but less powerfully around social justice and some other of these issues. But they do exist as organisations on the ground. And you can see that around national planning reform, where you've got organisations like Sustrans and all of those bodies kind of heavily involved in the planning reform process. And some of those are represented at local level. But essentially, I think it's about being in at the beginning of the formulation of that plan, and the alignment of political and technical awareness about these issues is the magic moment. If you've got that, and you can see that. Okay, question. Why does Cornwall have such an exceptional record on dealing with climate change in local plan policy? Because the officers and the politicians were really closely aligned, and they managed to drive that through, and as a result of which they're now way out in front in relation to tackling emissions through new housing. So that's the relationship you need. They had a population that wanted to do it. And increasingly, I think we're seeing that change, is all I would say. I think despite the fact that I'm obviously a miserable sod at heart, I'm very optimistic that when you get involved in community development as planners, you actually tap into this amazing appetite for change. People understand much more than is assumed about what's good for their communities on the whole.
I'm very briefly, how important are public health in this discussion?
Well, I think the best I've seen local plan preparation processes is a group of planners who wanted to do the right thing, work with their public health colleagues and put the head director of public health on the stand at the local plan inquiry. It totally blew away the objections from the development sector, and so our intelligenced, that's a phrase which isn't, the planning inspectorate, that, you know, they basically couldn't do anything other than go, well, I'm sorry, this sounds like a great idea. It's the alignment, it's getting those actors into the room and getting those experts on the stand, that proved to be very, very powerful. People, I mean, it's essentially people just need to talk to each other across teams and recognise that the planners in the local plan are funneling all that stuff, and then making a powerful case to a planning inspector and supporting them in doing that.
I might also just add in there that it is about finding that local lens that makes sense and that gains traction. So for some areas like Cornwall, that will be climate and sustainability. And that's okay, because you can weave in all sorts of active environment stuff with that, because it all fits together. But it's that is the leverage point that sort of opens doors. And for other places, that it might be a particular health issue in the population, or it might be children, but it is finding that sort of one issue. And sometimes it will be nicely set out for you in a council's sort of corporate strategy. You know, we want all our children to grow up healthy and happy. Great. So how does that translate into every other policy and strategy that you've got? And it's about finding those sort of frameworks and lenses that you can use and sort of gather everything underneath for this sort of groundswell of going in the right direction. Is there anything else anybody wants to bring up at this point? I think we generally covered the things that were in the chat, and if not, we'll move on to planning reform.
Thanks, Gemma. Okay, so I'm going to take this a little bit, even quicker, if that's okay, and just do some highlights of that. This is the levelling up bill, which if you ever wanted to be, I don't know, bewildered, is the place to be. And what I'll do is quickly run through some of the key elements of it to set out what I think what the landscape of planning reform will look like. And indeed, this is what the landscape of planning reform will look like. So there is no core vision, no elegant organisational idea behind the government's planning reform agenda. It starts from the premise that they regard planning as a problem, and they'd really rather it went away. And most of the levelling up bill is sort of various forms of procedural kind of fixes, but without any sense of the sort of creative force that planning could have. So let me just take you through some of the kind of headlines of the levelling up bill, which is currently in the House of Lords, goes to back into the Commons, we think, in sort of June, July. I would just flag to you all that there's a little bit of a chance that this might not happen. The government seems to have one or two other problems, but nonetheless, we expect this whole agenda to come trundling through and impact on you, as I'll say in a second, sometime in the middle of next year. Okay, next slide. The key reform measures, it's a planning bill mostly, not a levelling up bill. That's really important. The levelling up sections are very brief at the beginning and really don't mean very much. This is not at the radicalism of the planning white paper, which was essentially talking about the abolition of planning. To be fair to the government, their argument is that it will harness things like digitisation, focus on design codes, make local plans easier. But there are buts to it. It gives the Secretary of State much more power, and national development management policies, which I'll talk about in a second, will for the first time overrule local plans in law. And that's very important because you guys at the local level have done all the innovation, right, about active travel or climate change in planning. None of that has come from the centre. It's all come from inspired, heroic work at local authority level. So giving the Secretary of State more power to outrank your local plan determined locally, for me, is not only not democratic, it's also actually a way of squashing that innovation. And it's partly why it's being done. So the centre doesn't like people being ambitious about things because they get kickback from the development sector that they're being asked to do, well, in my view, basic things to make good development. So there's a lot of secondary legislation, and also there's a review of the National Planning Policy Framework. And I'm really not making this up when I say there's a review of the NPPF going on now, and we expect the publication of a new version that goes with the existing system. But then there's also a parallel process of writing a brand new NPPF to go with the new planning system that this bill will essentially frame. Confused? You should be. But the point is that sometime in 2024, the whole of the NPPF will be rewritten. And that's what makes your life quite difficult on the ground. Next slide, please. Timescales we've seen. The bill is delayed a little bit, but they might get it through by the summer, and then you can see the National Planning Policy Framework. Yeah, in theory, 2024, and then from that starting point, there's 30 months for you all from the spring of 2024 to replace your local plans. And you keep wanting to say, yeah, right, that's going to happen, but that's the timescale they're working on. Next slide, please. So the new local plan, and this is really important, probably the most important slide just in this section I'll show you, because this is the structure of the new plan that you'll get. So I just want to focus on the bits that are important. First of all, one, this is the opportunity will there to do spatial development strategies, and that will be cross local authority. You'll be able to do that in partnership with other local authorities. There's no public right to be heard in the development of that, which is a major problem for us, but that's voluntary. So the duty to cooperate, which currently exists, is being abolished. There's no regional plans being replaced, but you'll have the opportunity to enter into these voluntary arrangements. It will have the status of a development plan if you decide to prepare it. And so it is a very important part of the furniture. But whether there'll be an incentive to cooperate between local authorities is another matter. Then you have the local plan, much slimmed down, is the theory from government. Quite a lot of development management policies will be taken to the centre. And that's a very interesting and controversial move. And then you have minerals and waste local plans as normal. Then you'll have supplementary plans, which will take supplementary planning guidance kind of scope, but make that part of the development plan. And that's quite important because it means that there'll be more formality around that. And that's where design codes will probably fit in these supplementary plans, which are designed to be more detailed. They're voluntary, by the way. So the only part that's mandatory is the local plan. The supplementary plans are voluntary. And then again, that's where design coding might fit. The neighbourhood plans we already have, and the policies map, which goes with the local plan, is mandatory as well. So it's a very significant change to the elements of the plan and their legal status, and it's worth keeping a close eye on that. Okay, next slide, please. Legal status of the development plan. We've been talking a long while. Let me not go through this in any detail, but essentially this just confirms that the local plan is no longer the primary document. That in fact the government's managed to get control, if it gets this through, of a document that it can write with more power than the local plan. So that's important. And it means that whatever decides to go into development management policy at the centre will be extraordinarily powerful and will overrule any local democratic decision that's made on the ground. Next slide, please. And this is what national development management policy will mean. This is the instrument by which they'll do it. So lots of people are trying to get, I mean, we're all talking about it, Gemma, aren't we? Can we get 20-minute neighbourhoods and net zero and everything else into national development management policy? And I know we have to do that in one sense, but I keep coming back to the point that it is profoundly anti-democratic to do this in this way. It's taking powers that you used to have at the local level, a bit like permitted development. You used to have powers to stop this stuff, and putting them in the centre or removing them altogether. So you can see the power of national development management policy there. Next slide, please. And this is 106 in the infrastructure levy. So we're going to have section 106. The original idea was to replace SIL in section 106 with something called a national infrastructure levy. It's going to be mandatory and will replace SIL and most parts of section 106. And it's based on a new formulation, which will be set centrally, although the individual rates can be set locally. What can I say about the infrastructure levy? If you actually look at it, they're now saying it will take 10 years to implement the new levy, and will be a sort of test and move kind of system where they'll learn on the way about how to do it. What I actually said to the minister, which is why I suspect I'm not going to see any elevation, was, can you please tell us what the marginal benefit of the new system is over the old system? And in fact, I can't see any. I think that basically what you've got, keeping section 106 for big schemes, so 106 doesn't disappear completely. I think the levy itself is you know, might be slightly administratively easier. That remains to be a question. But here's the thing: the pot of money at the heart, the development value at the heart of section 106 and the infrastructure levy is the same. That pot of money is large in Kensington and Chelsea and non-existent in low demand areas. The most important issue to remember is that net gain as a legal obligation is the only legal obligation now that local authorities have in relation to section 106. So in other words, net gain comes first in the negotiation. You must have net gain. And developers use the same development value pot to pay for their net gain responsibilities. And that means that affordable housing and health and active travel sit behind net gain in the priority for funding. And because development values are fixed and finite in each individual area, it means that actually, and you've got no legal obligations around your agenda around affordable housing, there's no legal obligation to provide it. It means that actually, I think there'll be a big bun fight for the remaining values of this. It isn't the transformational measure anyway, in summary, that we thought it might be. Changes to CPO and changes to development corporations also in there. Some of them are quite positive, some but will take quite a long time to filter through. Next slide.
Sorry, Hugh, just take a step back and explain net gain, because I'm not sure that everyone followed that bit.
Yeah, I'm not sure I did. So the Environment Act created a new obligation on planning called net gain for nature, essentially, which means that each development has to be able to show that there is a positive net gain in biodiversity terms from the development. The process can work in two ways. It either works in the creation of on-site or off-site ecosystems, if that's what they want to do, or a credit system. where the developer can certainly buy credits, and that money can be used off-site, and which is why some of the environment organisations are overjoyed by it, because they can see benefits to their big nature reserves. I find it horrific because for me as a planner, we shouldn't be embarking on development that doesn't intrinsically create net gain for nature and people inside the site boundary, because that's what a good environment looks like for people. But the problem is that the cost of net gain it falls on the developer, and it comes out of the same pot of Section 1 development values, so that Section 106 is trying to tap. But because net gain is a legal duty in planning law, and affordable housing and active travel and all the other stuff isn't a legal duty, it means that net gain is first in the queue for the money, and means the residual amounts then are going to be reduced. That means less affordable housing, less money for active travel, because net gain got there first. Now, some of these things can be integrated in good design, so it's not perhaps as bleak as it looks, but it's still something the government has completely failed to consider in bringing this forward. Yeah, thank you, Julie. That was the best way of describing it. Managed to read that in the chat. I hope that's clear. It is really, it's not so much cutting edge, it's probably quite self-evident, but it's not being talked about by the government, and so we're really worried about it, because obviously there's less money circulating for the stuff we need to do. Hope that's okay, Gemma. Shall I press on?
I think so.
We're a bit worried about time, so I'll hurry up. So strategic planning has talked about duty to cooperate, talked about joint plans being made, and the ability of local authorities to enter into it on a voluntary basis. So basically dealt with that. Next slide, please. So this is important, environmental outcomes reporting. And again, Gemma, I hate to talk about this because I feel like we're about to drop down another, techie rabbit hole, but here we go. If people are familiar with environmental impact assessment and strategic environmental assessment of plans and development, these were two, insofar as I was concerned, because I'm so old and I can remember planning before the EU and these existed, these were brilliant measures that made us think about the environment when we were considering development. None of that used to happen. When these things came in the 80s and early 90s, they transformed the way, but they also created an industry of highly complex environmental impact reports. So as a result of Brexit, the government have decided to basically trash the entire SEA and environmental impact assessment process. And here's the most important thing. EIA and SEA were the legal hook for health impact assessments because they required us to consider the impact of development on human populations. The new environmental outcomes reporting regime, which is being consulted on, does not require planners to think about the impact of development on human populations. And that that is a right 6 for the number of times I bang my head on the desk as a result of that measure. So in other words, the government have taken a very traditional view of what they consider to be the environment, and apparently the environment doesn't include people. Now they're doing that because they want to simplify the system. It's as simple as that. What we're worried about is that local authority planners will have to justify much harder assessments of health inequality or health impacts of particular development. And we'll have to really try very hard to get developers to talk about that and provide evidence about it. Anyway, that consultation's ongoing, and not that you've all got time, but it's one to shout about if you can. Is that okay? I think, Gemma, just as a quick view. So people lose out is a summary of that. Next slide, please. Yeah, survival strategies for planning reform, just 2 or 3 to end on here. Psychologically, the survival strategy for planning reform is really important. Let's not pretend as a group of people that national government, whoever they are trying to do a good job in planning reform terms to make it easier for us to deliver our agendas. Everyone I speak to at the local level is operating despite the system that's been created, not because of it. So let's not pretend, let's not try and suggest this is all good stuff. Let's actually have a mindset where we go, what can we positively do with the framework we've got? How can we innovate around it? What's the wriggle room? What's the space to do the good things we need to do? But don't try and persuade people that the system is logical or rational or elegant or sensible, because it isn't. I mean, it really isn't. So it's important then to use the tools that you've got, like design coding, like Article 4s, which is a way of withdrawing permitted development rights. It's hard work, but it's potentially a way of doing it. And then don't be surprised by these long transition periods or by delivering change on the shoestring. And also, ultimately, you're in the right space. I can't say this enough. The future of our society depends on tackling the issues that you're trying to represent. You're in the right place. It will take some time for people to catch up, but you must not lose heart, I don't think, around that stuff. A bit like with climate change, reality will eventually impact on national government policy making. I'm that optimistic or delusional, depending on how you look at it. Next slide, please. And at the local level, some people are talking about, well, let's not do a local plan because there's all this uncertainty, or, you know, that's not the right choice. Push hard at the moment to get the right strategic priorities. Be smart to be able to identify them so they'll unplug from the existing system and plug into the new one, by which I mean that strong and evidence-based and deliverable policy is the nugget that you need, and then you can basically unplug it from the old and plug it into a new local plan process, so long as you've got that evidence and you've got that strategy. You can see how design codes and standards are important, the focus on health and well-being, the focus on climate change. These are all things that communities want, I think. So those are things I think that are clearly there. And strategic housing delivery is really important. And I have to say, I think it's clear already that depending on what happens, you know, in the next 18 months, you will probably find a return to things like strategic planning happening, because we'll have to, because that's the only way you can manage the country, actually. Next slide, please. These are opportunities for influence. I'll just kind of leave these final slides quickly. You can see where they are: National Planning Policy Framework, the bill is coming to the end of that, and then the big debate around National Development Management Policy. Everybody wants to get, as I said, to get their key issue into that. I'm quite sceptical about how much government will do, but you know, that is an opportunity. Next slide, please. Okay, so that is the content of planning reform. I'm trying to do it at immense speed, so my apologies for that. And if there's anything else people want to raise with me about that, then please do.
There were a couple of things that came up in the chat. So this was from Nick. So are we seen as a hindrance or an irritant by planning departments because we may be lobbying or asking questions that get in the way of progressing applications easily and quickly?
That's a good question, Nick. Really, really good question. And I think it depends. I actually think that most planners are caught in this kind of dilemma, that they're under immense pressure to process applications, you know, on the right time scale and to deliver development. That's one pressure they're under. That said, if you cut up the average planner in half, they will be talking about climate change and active travel, have been written all the way through them. So I think there's basic professional sympathy for these arguments. But I think what they need is a bit of mutual understanding and communication. Planners are under immense pressure with very, very little resource. They need information that's useful to them, and they need to make sure that as that information comes in, for example, it does play into the NPPF agenda. So you get what I would call this kind of national policy blindness, that the planners making the decision have a set of triggers which are defined by national policy, and everything we say to them in terms of influencing change needs to be about saying, but the NPPF says this, which is why active travel should be important in this application. So it's applying your set of knowledge through this kind of Alice in Wonderland world of planning policy. And once you bound those things together, you can be 100% more effective, which is what I say to communities as well. You know, this is often an issue of competing languages and cultures, but actually the closer the relationship, just love your planners, form relationships with them, take them out to dinner. You know, that's what we need. We need basically to make this communication work. I don't think they're intrinsically not trying to do the right thing. I think they're under massive amounts of pressure at the moment with a system that doesn't work.
Nick Evans, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I mean, I was just going to come back from what Hugh was saying. I mean, the planners, yeah, they're up against, you know, very defined timescales, not this. So what they're looking for all the time is robust evidence or stuff like that will help them come to a decision on a planning application, information that's well thought out and you can't argue with. I mean, so for an example that we've, you know, where we've been very successful in the past of negotiating money into sport is all through our planning tools that we've developed, all for robust evidence base, which developers can't argue with, because there's no way that they can look at it, or haven't got the time to go back into looking at it. So you know, pulling together information locally, you know, using active lives data and other data that we've got locally, putting it into something that can easily be digested by the developer from their position about what they need to put into their development to help support development of active environments, or for the planning officer or whatever, is always kind of welcome.
Dave?
Thanks, Gemma. Hey, I kind of see two roles really for active partnerships locally. One is getting involved in the local plan process, and I'm sure there's still more advice there about how they connect with that. But also in terms of developments, and especially large sustainable urban extensions and new housing developments. My question is that I see time and time again lots of what I would call mediocre developments, volume house builder designs that just about meet the minimum standards but do nothing really in terms of creating a behaviour step change for people to walk and cycle and go outdoors more. Within that sort of application process, where should active partnerships be putting their energy to try and influence that local urban design so that we get the good quality walking and cycling infrastructure, the more green spaces, the kind of pushback on the mediocre developments that meet the minimum standards but don't do anything in terms of encouraging people to be more active?
There's a very, I mean, I think the general rule is the earlier the better, and not just in terms of political influence. So I think in influencing those large scale developments, which if you're talking about the sort of 2,000, 2,500 homes sort of development at the bigger end of the scale, they're a long gestation period, which begins or should begin in the local plan process where you get the right policy in the right place. The reason it's really important to start at the very beginning is actually about money more than anything. And it's called this mechanism called right pricing land. The way that the development sector argue out or basically game you out of good policy at the local level is to say that it's unviable. You know, there just isn't the development value in here. They obviously have in planning policy, which is extraordinary, a guarantee by government of a 20% profit margin per unit. That's written into national policy. I don't think it's written into it. I can't think of another business who thinks. Then development industry say, well, we need that because our developments are so horribly uncertain because of planning, except 90% of all planning applications for housing are approved. 87% of them approved on time, and 320,000 units of housing approved in this country a year, which is 100,000 more than are actually built. Discuss. But to get to the point, if you set the very high standards in policy at the beginning of a development plan, or in the case of a scale development, a master planning process, then the developer can factor those policy requirements into the price paid for land. Most often they'll have optioned the land, but not paid for it. And the effect of setting high standards is actually to depress the value that landowners get from the development process. Because developers will say, well, I'm preserving my 20%, so I'm not going to pay you that for the land because this local authority is requiring this kind of basically high standard of design policy. So the sooner you've got that baked into the development process, the better for everybody. And then essentially the developer has nothing to argue about. They don't care what you ask for, so long as they've paid the right price for the land. Now, it doesn't work everywhere, Dave, as you know, because in low demand areas, you have a problem, don't you, about whether the headroom is there. But as a general rule, what that means is you need to be at the very beginning of that debate. Final thing is that developers, you know, some of my best friends are volume house builders. They just operate in the system that they've managed to game over the last sort of 30 years. It's not their fault the rules are the rules. You want to know why the problem is, it's the way government has set the rules. I think parts of the development sector are moving in the right place. And we very rarely bother to reach out and talk to them. Sometimes that's a waste of time, but actually locally, I really don't think it is. I think we need to build a relationship and say there is value in building to this standard, as well as there is requirement. Building in that value is a conversation to begin to have with them. What strikes me as really frightening is that many of the volume house builders don't, for example, have climate change in their business model. And the shocking moment where you say to them, but no one's part of the reinsurance scheme. There were people homes built after 2009 are not part of the flood reinsurance scheme. So if you build them in the wrong place, they'll never be able to get household flood insurance. You do know that, don't you, as a group of volume house? And of course, none of them do. And so you can see that there's an economic benefit ultimately to them beginning to come on this journey, but always soonest the best. Having a conversation absolutely upfront about the process, trying to retrofit it when things have been approved, extremely difficult, Dave, isn't it? You know, when you get to planning permission stage, it's kind of almost too late. You need to be upstream.
Oh, Simon?
So Hugh, on that, how would you recommend, what's the best time or tactic to engage volume house builders or master developers? Is there a sweet spot in timing, or are there forums that you think would be efficient ways of engaging across at county level?
I mean, there are some forums, but most of the volume house builders operate, obviously, you know, HBF operate national forums and the BPF, and they're extremely influential national organisations. But I think that the sweet spot is definitely in relation to the intelligence about what's happening in relation to a local plan or the development of a master plan. It's being able to talk to planners at the right stage, say, look, we've got a strong interest here. And as Nick said earlier, having that evidence base prepared, having those resources ready to go at the beginning of the local plan process. Now, it's ever so straightforward to find that out, you know, if you're in a county amongst a constituency of districts or whatever the formulation is, because you can just see what timescales on their websites they're at in relation to local plan review, for example. And it's being in at that formative stage, because the development sector are smart enough to understand that their influential point is also at the beginning of the development plan. That's when they've got stuck into the process. And so that's where you need to be represented, essentially. So the issues and options stage of local plan making at the very beginning is actually where the debate needs to be. And also, I think, in relation to the way that land allocation goes, which is simple as this: when people start doing their strategic housing needs assessment and the land availability assessments, in the worst authorities, that becomes a beauty parade, right, for land which developers own, not where the most sustainable location is, it's just where the developers happen to own the land. And they'll then promote those sites into the local plan, regardless of their sustainable development credentials. Local planners, on the other hand, should be turning around and saying, no, these are the sites where there is common agreement about sustainable location, which is almost the first test of an active travel question, isn't it? Is it in the right place? Is this site going to have any chance of supporting these principles? Because it's not actually bolted on in the sort of crazy way we're seeing. So yeah, absolutely upfront, having the intel, and that's how many civil society groups work. They're watching really hard to see local plan preparation processes go forward, preparing the resources in advance, making sure that being prepared to turn up to the examination. I mean, being an examination to a local plan is better than daytime television. It's so much fun. It really is. I mean, you know, you get to sit there with a bunch of planners and other technocrats arguing about serious, but going there and being persuasive, you know, and being in the room and responding to the cross-examination from the expensive developer barristers. It's not a court of law, after all. You can say what you like within reason. But that is time consuming, I think, Simon. That's the challenge for networks. It's time consuming and it might feel boring, but that is where follow the money. Follow the money. That's where the developers are.
I guess it might be worth mentioning, I'll just throw up on screen that we developed this this diagram for public health, thinking about how public health can influence the local plan process. And it's something we could actually do, is to make a version of this for active partnerships that might be useful. There's a bit of a, you know, at least there's a flow chart of how it works and where you might be able to influence. So that's something as a steering group we can take away and have a think about for sure. Sophie.
Hi, sorry, Hugh, you seem like a very frank and honest person. Great presentation. So I'm going to ask you a frank and honest question. In terms of, I know what you've said about influencing the system and around the local plans, and we are getting roped into a huge amount of conversations, which is great because we're having conversations with planners, but we're getting involved in them at that too later stage, like you said, when it gets to that point and it's too late. Is it not worth having those conversations at all, or are we wait? Because I mean, I've been in rooms where I've spent hours with developers having conversations about how pitches should be built, and I raised it in our breakout room. Actually, there was a specific example of a football pitch that had been built on essentially an island cliff face, with a footbridge was the only entry to it, no parking, it was just a footbridge to this island. and the planners hadn't even thought about like ball retention. Their answer to that was a chain link fence. So all these things, and we're spending time, and it is, as you know, consuming. And yeah, I guess my question is it not worth even those conversations prior to that local plan stage, after that local plan stage, sorry?
The truth is it really is worth it, although it's so frustrating for you, I know, but it really is worth it. But the reason it's worth it is because what you're doing, you need to see it as relationship management with a planning team. The planners are hard pressed. I mean, with all due respect, also not necessarily the most experienced now, because we've lost so many planners out of the system. And what you're doing is learning going on. And what you're saying is there are two objectives in such a meeting. One, how could we have been so bloody stupid, all right? And then secondly, okay, having been so stupid, a bit like with permitted development, how are we going to learn about this for the future of policy development in this area? And that is valuable, because essentially what you're saying is, so when we do the local plan review, what we want you to think about is how you've managed to cock up all this development and why the policy frame didn't allow you to actually deliver the outcomes you needed to deliver, and what you need to do to put that right. The difficult, I think, is that you, in those conversations, to be cost effective, they need to have an output, and the output is going to be your submission as a network to the local plan. A bit like with my PDR pictures, you're going to be able to say, this is what goes wrong. Here are pictures of what goes wrong. This is how we will fix it in the future. So it is worth it, but there is no doubt that being involved in those conversations is both frustrating, and all you can do at that point in the immediate is to try to make the world a little bit less, well, to be polite about it, a little less bad, okay, than it otherwise would have been. Whereas using that as an impetus to write a new local plan is actually, you know, a lot of it's about culture, Sophie, on the ground. Some of the local authorities, developers are absolutely triumphant, and they're used to bullying local government officials and officers, and they're used to getting their own way, and the culture is essentially up yours. And that's what we have to change. We really have to change that. They are not in charge. They think they are, but they're not, he said. And so, you know, and a bit of that is bluff, as you can hear in my voice, but it's important bluff.
Just picking up what you're saying about culture there, then, Hugh, there's a question about, is there merit in active partnerships trying to establish sort of local healthy placemaking forums or groups, you know, across either across a whole county where you've got a two-tier, or within a unitary area, that sort of try to bring together different key agencies to create influence?
I absolutely think there is, but it's easy for us to say, isn't it? Because you've actually got to spend time doing it and have capacity to do it. But the interesting thing we find at the TCPA, Gemma, I suppose, in terms of influence, a lot of our influence comes because, even though we really can't afford it, we offer a lot of free training, and we offer a lot of conversations to people and support to people. And I think planners have very few training budgets left. There are very few opportunities for professional development because all those budgets have been cut. So you might find some sweet spots there in terms of being able to talk about this agenda. And I do think, despite the fact I've been such a miserable sod, the way to persuade people is to show them the positives, you know, that actually, and where public health teams are coming together with active travel to produce this kind of really powerful vision of how places can support people's mental and physical health and well-being, and how that can have knock-on effects on the value of the development, and also effects on reducing the price of, you know, the cost of social care in the future, for example.
I also find when I work with local authorities that everyone loves a good example of someone who's already done it. So it's actually gathering that together as well. And, you know, a lot of planning policy writing, I hope this is not out of place to say, is actually magpieing and just getting together bits that you like and make sense and fit your narrative that you're stringing together and are upheld by your evidence as well. But, you know, you can take some of that legwork out of it if you don't have to start from scratch. And there are good examples out there. And I think what Hugh was saying about the TCPA is that we can also unlock some of those sort of barriers to conversation, especially perhaps in two-tier areas where there might be even extra amounts of politics between counties and districts, whereas if it's badged as a TCPA conversation or a piece of guidance, then it sort of has a bit of a an outside legitimacy that perhaps you aren't going to be able to move the story along as much if it's badged from one authority to another.
I think, Gemma, that's right. And it's interesting, the parallel, isn't it? We've got now in our climate work, we've produced a guide with the RTPI because government wouldn't, on how to implement climate change action. We've now got a secondary online resource about case studies of all the local authorities' best practice in relation to that. So that's a similar thing that we need, isn't it? We may have it, Gemma, it may exist. But you're quite right that there are two things about policy development. I've made a career out of stealing really good policy development because I'm not a creative person. But secondly, I'm also determined that local plan policy should be written in a certain way. No, please don't say where feasible, where viable, just to please the planning inspectorate. Use emphatic and precise language, which allows developers to understand what you want clearly and for them to price in the requirements. But we've got caught in local plan policy and writing stuff that frankly is meaningless most of the time. Would it be okay if we had a footpath every other Tuesday on early closing if it's okay with you, but we don't want to bother you about it? And I've literally seen policy that bad in local plans. No, it's going to be this. This is what we want, and this is, and then everyone is clear about it, and it's much harder to game that kind of policy formulation. And you can see it in national law on planning, and you can see it in national policy on planning as well. So it's not as if it's outlandish. So
if there are no other sort of immediate questions, Hugh, if I was going to put you on the spot, what would be your summary advice, or your key point, or less than 10?
The key point is a personal one, really, I think, which is that you know what, the success of making these places that will have such a legacy for people's lives relies on all of you in your partnerships and your work being heroic in the face of quite difficult circumstances. This is going to get better. Times will change, and then we're going to be really reliant on all of your expertise. So, as I've often said to planners, I'll say to all of you, no one's allowed to retire. No one's allowed to leave the cause. You all have to stick with it. But I think keeping our morale up is actually probably the most important thing here. It really is. This stuff is not peripheral. It's not woke. It's not whatever. I mean, being a woke supporter, but we're not going to be marginalized. This is the heart of making good places. This is the legacy that will actually mean that future generations will have some kind of future. So I think sticking with it, but trying to be as smart as we can, Gemma, isn't it? That's the issue, about devoting our time to those places that really matter. And in the quick summary that is the local plan.
Yeah, and that's taking that long-term approach. And I would say never underestimate that conversation you had or that relationship that you're building, because that's usually where the fruitfulness of the work comes actually into play, because it changes how somebody approaches something and what they're thinking about when they approach it. And it just might be that they, off the back of that, ask a different question, and that's really key. Right, I think we'll probably wrap it up there. Thank you, Hugh. Really, really great discussion, and hopefully people got some stuff out of it. We'll just run the poll again, if that's all right, Simon, and then we'll move on. And I think there's a bit of a Sport England update from Nick. So, but if we could just run the poll again, and it's a bit like having your homework marked in real time, isn't it, Hugh? But hopefully there'll be a bit of a change towards a greater understanding. But as Hugh has pointed out, most of us, even working in it, don't really understand the ins and outs. So that's okay. Well, that's good. Hopefully you can see some of the results there, but we have shifted in the right direction.
I'll give it another few seconds and then publish it. Okay, I'll publish now.
So there we go. So I think Hugh will deserve his lunchtime biscuit with a cup of tea after that. So thank you for that. If there are other things that people would really like to cover around planning, and if we were going to do either a deeper dive, or there are things that you still sort of want to unpack a bit more, it would be really great if you could add those. I don't know if you can add them to the poll in a short answer, or if you can't, then pop it in the chat. But it does look like you would be able to, free text a short answer into this poll. So yeah, if there's anything else that you'd like the steering group to sort of arrange in a community of practice to cover, then that would be absolutely brilliant to know about, and we can certainly look towards trying to provide some more information and resource and training around this subject. So yeah, please do that, and we will look to incorporate that in the future. We'll just leave that running for a second so that people have got time to add a few things. I guess we could even potentially leave it running in the background whilst we get Nick to give a bit of a Sport England update, if that's all right.
Yeah, I can provide a quick update just on that. So I'll just go a couple of things. So some of you may be aware that we've been kind of just reorganising ourselves internally. So we're now kind of 4 pillars within the Place Directorate. So Place Relationships, which is led by Adam Wigglesworth, which is going to deal with the kind of place expansion work, and Brian Whaley has moved, and his team has moved across into that. Have any of you who've worked with Brian previously? The Place Development team is effectively our former capital team, and a technical team with that. There's Place Learning, which is our kind of learning development team led by Louise, that deals with all the kind of work on this. Part of you been on the LGA leadership program, would have been in that. And then there's planning active environment. So I'm kind of leading that area, and Trudy, you might have known Trudy Else, she's and her team have moved across into my team. So in terms of kind of where we are moving forward at the moment around the active environments with big issue work, we've kind of agreed at the moment within the organisation we're really slimming that down, and that's partly because of the wider work around place. So a lot of the work is going to go through the place-based working in the future. So we come down to kind of 3 areas we're focusing on, which is championing the improvement by design of space and places to enable everyday physical activity, which is very much what TCPA and Hugh from what this call was about just now. Then around strengthening connections between organisations who own, operate spaces and places to enable everyday physical activity, and that's really building on our work with National Trust, Forestry, and some of the housing associations, reactivating that work. And the last one is accelerating the change in the provision of sustainable community facilities. So across those areas, the priorities really for this year is the active design rollout. I'll come back to that in a second. Starting to reactivate that work with housing associations and realign some of our work with National Trust to some of the places we'd like to be working with. And then lastly is this stuff around building the cross-sector consensus around the future of leisure. So that has been a major part of work, being in the capital team and working with the operators and local authorities around that kind of bit. So that's kind of fits under the wider kind of active environments work. So just really the main thing we're kind of working on at the moment is the active design launch, which is going to take place on Thursday. So hopefully most of you signed up for that. We've now got well over 800 people signed up for it. So that's quite good in terms of that. We're also now thinking about the post rollout of that. We are working with OHID around a series of kind of workshops, sort of on-site practical workshops. So actually happening in places across the country. So for example, Halton Rugby, a few other places across the country. So 9 regional workshops where we're looking, it's targeted. So looking at bringing together local health professionals with some of the local planners to sort of walk around the site and then develop it into a workshop. And we'll be looking to try and invite a rep from each of the active partnerships to those. It's probably going to be around sort of 40 to 50 people tops to do those. So we're commissioning that work at the moment, and then we're also thinking about the other things we're starting to work in this place is a kind of commissioning some consultancy support to develop a package of training work around that. So particularly sort of half day or full day type workshops that consultants can actually run with local authorities or other partners to actually have a bit more of a deep dive into the active design work. So that's kind of where the update is at the moment